everybody. Welcome to our 5th episode of America at its Best. My name is Rebecca Painter, and I will be your host for today's show. I'm coming to you from Columbia, South Carolina. Here's the latest and greatest from my state. The governor lifted our stay-at-home order as of Monday. Now, full disclaimer, I haven't actually left my house yet because I haven't had a chance, but it is good to now be a part of a society that's slowly and safely starting to reopen. So I'll report back on that next week when we talk. Unfortunately, one thing that hasn't changed since last time I saw you guys is me having the ability to come see you and talk with you about everything you're making possible with your partnership with State Policy Network. Our conversations fuel so much of the great work this network has been doing, and it's been tough not to hear from you as often. And we want to make sure that you know all the good things happening because of your partnership. And that is why we started the show 5 weeks ago, and we're glad that you're back for another episode to hear some good news for a change. Now, with that, I want to repeat what Alyssa said because it's so important. Please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask a question or make a comment. We want to hear from you throughout the show. Now, last week, in case you missed it, we had a robust conversation about education. We talked about ways the network is ensuring children are still getting educated even though schools are shut down. And parents, some of them are losing their minds just a little bit while they have to work and educate their children. We also talked about how the Overton window is upon us in terms of being able to advocate for more school choice. And polling is showing us that more and more parents are demanding choices in education. So you will hear more from us on that in the future. And if you missed the show and you'd like to have a copy of it, just let us know and we will send you the video. Now, today we have a great show in store for you. We are going to be talking about not just safely reopening the economy, but how we ensure that we can revitalize the economy. And we've got two guests I'd like to introduce to you. We've got Ray Hederman joining us from Ohio's Buckeye Institute. Ray is a nationally recognized expert on both healthcare and economics. Ray, we're so glad to have you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Glad to be here.
We also will be joined by Taylor Dawson from the Beacon Institute in Tennessee. Some of you may remember Taylor last year at our annual meeting if you were with us. She was recognized for her unique ability to connect with members of her community to solve problems. So Taylor's out there in the trenches and she's on the front lines as we continue to move forward with solutions. Taylor, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Now, before we dive in with you two, first, we'd like to have a word with my favorite guest every week, Miss Tracy Sharp, the leader of State Policy Network. Tracy, thanks for being here with us today. What's new in California?
Well, unlike South Carolina, we are still on lockdown, but much to my chagrin. But I will say that yesterday, our governor said he would allow some counties their own decision-making on how they roll out business openings, which I think is great because there are several counties that either have 0 or less than 5 cases. So we've talked a lot about flexibility. We talked about it last week when we were discussing education. And I think having local flexibility will help. So.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you said time and time again that it is the role of the state think tank to come forth and have those conversations with localities because every is not a one-size-fits-all, as you often remind us. Now, as we continue to have these difficult conversations in states all across the country and within those local communities, how well positioned is this network to really help both revitalize the state economy and give advice on how to safely reopen at this point?
Sure. I mean, that's a great question. The fact is, the Great Recession of a decade ago was a good practice run for this network. And since then, the size, the scope, the sophistication across the network has grown dramatically. The state groups, in addition, are more connected than ever, right? The Buckeye Institute in Ohio, when they have a breakthrough and a policy win, we can quickly share that and analyze it and then customize it, have other states customize it for their state. Or when Beacon in Tennessee reaches a new audience, we can share that information and those tactics. And what it does is it accelerates the learning process and the growth across the network. So that's why you're seeing a lot more multi-state policy movements, such as right to try, occupational licensure, transparency, right? And this couldn't happen without this connectivity and the willingness to share. And very importantly, supporters like those on this call who've put gas in the tank to help these grow more quickly. It's the role this network was really meant for, and it's why our supporters have spent time and treasure to help build it over the years.
Well, Tracy, last question for you. We had some latest polling from SPN come in recently that shows a growing divide between Republicans and Democrats in terms of their thinking, can we reopen the economy or should we all just stay at home? And State Policy Network has always been about trying to bring people together and find solutions we can all agree on. Do you think, how are you thinking that this network can handle a divide like that moving forward?
Yeah, it's true. It's true and not surprising that it's become more politicized and polarized, that we're going back to that. What I think the gap that's opening up is for this network to show its brand of really community problem solving. Really, it's in the American DNA to have a natural problem solving, private voluntary problem solving at the state and local level. And I think we can distinguish our state-based brand in this way, where each group works with what it knows best for its state. And I think our speakers will address that today, and I'm looking forward to it. This is such an important call today about reopening the economy. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. I appreciate that. We'll be hearing more from you throughout the show, I'm sure. And with that, let's turn it over to our first guest, Ray Hederman from the Buckeye Institute in Ohio. Ray, someone called and said, we've got to get Ray on the show. And they described you as the guy who everyone stops to listen to on matters of tax, the economy, and budgets. So we are really glad to have you with us today.
Thank you.
You and Taylor, who we'll hear from later, were among the first two organizations to get recommendations straight to your governor on how to get people safely back to work and revitalize the economy. Tell us a little bit about why you think you were so fast and why your governor was open to hearing from you and implementing those reforms.
Sure. So I think we always saw this as kind of a two-step problem. The first problem, obviously, was the national health crisis. But just as importantly, we saw so many businesses having to shut their doors, which we knew would have a major impact on people's well-being. How are they going to keep their job? We also knew that tax dollars were going to fall for the state. And unlike the federal government, those of us at the state levels, we have to balance our budgets. So we knew that the state was going to face some painful options and choices. So we wanted to make sure that Governor DeWine heard from us quickly about our recommendations so that he knew the best way to protect Ohioans was not to raise taxes, but to cut spending. And really, we spent a lot of years kind of tilling the soil, making sure that we have established personal relationships with key legislative stakeholders, the executive branch, people in the legislature, their chief of staff. So when we had specific ideas, when we were able to give them the recommendations of here's where you should cut, here's why you should freeze state spending, the governor was able to hear those recommendations and we're able to talk to them in a time of crisis.
So one thing about what you said that really struck me is that your recommendations aren't anything new. These are probably recommendations I know you've been making for quite some time. But as I've said on previous shows, now there's a sense of urgency around this, and governors, both Democratic and Republican, are very hungry for ideas. So tell us a little bit, which is great and fantastic that you guys were ready. Tell us about some of the reforms that have been adopted so far by your governor.
Sure. So what the governor has done is basically done a lot on the healthcare side, adopting telehealth, allowing out-of-state doctors and nurses. On the fiscal side, though, Governor DeWine has made some equally impressive moves. He basically sat there and said, we are not going to hire any more state workers. He did this several weeks ago. The second thing is he started instructing agencies to prepare for a 20% cut. And just yesterday, he announced that this would be an $800 million cut over the next 2 months. And because, as you mentioned, we've been able to sit there and really scrub Ohio's budget over past years, we had specific recommendations. We were able to sit there and recommend to the executive branch, look, we can get $1 million of savings by deferring maintenance on some parks. We can get some more savings if we sit there and we rearrange how we're going to fund education over the next few weeks. And so having these specific bullet point ideas make it easier for the governor, his staff, to look at where the state needs to trim the fat from their budget.
So the core of this is around your budgeting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, I mean, we went from having a $200 million surplus where we were all working on tax cuts. Now, all of a sudden, in 2 months, we're looking at an $800 million deficit, a $1 billion fiscal swing. We've got to cut the state's budget. We can't look at taxes in a time when so many businesses are hurting.
That's really interesting. Tracy, let me bring this back to you for a second. Ray mentioned the surplus that they had before all this happened, and we know other states who aren't as fortunate as Ohio were already in a financial mess before this happened. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the network is approaching their budgets? Because if everybody has a page from Ohio, we're going to be in good shape. Where is the network on budgets and attacking budgets in this crisis?
Well, it's certainly a strength of the network. Every state think tank addresses fiscal policy to some degree or another, dealing with the budget, and to really equip policymakers and staff of governors' offices to cut the fat. And more than that, I think condition them for austerity and help them with practical, concrete ideas. And so we talk a lot about concepts on this call, but make no mistake, the state think tanks are pushing this into action. They are on the phone. They are talking with their policymakers because they've established those relationships, because they're there. They're one of them. Ray is an Ohioan. He's a Buckeye, right? So that's where the relationship matters, because they better understand what's going on in their state.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. Now, Ray, let's shift gears for a second. I understand that the Buckeye Institute put a policy menu together for your governor. Now, did you guys just come up with those on your own, or did you find a different way to figure out what the right policies were in this specific case?
Yeah, so we released a report, basically a roadmap to reopening Ohio. We wanted to do that while the governor was still thinking through his plans. And, you know, some of were ideas, but I mean, we got a lot of great feedback by going out, talking to Ohio business owners to tell us their story, what they needed to be able to do to be able to reopen safely.
So what did you hear from those folks, like on the ground?
Sure. So look, I'll take two quick stories. So one is we talked to the restaurant industry. Probably no sector has been more greatly affected than restaurateurs who've been forced to close. In Ohio, we're doing a slow reopen, but not for restaurants. So we know that if you know anything about the restaurant business, you know that most of their money comes from alcohol sales. And so while restaurants and pubs are trying to do takeout menus to help generate some revenue, keep some workers employed, they realized that what they really need to be able to do is have a way to maybe sell a cocktail or two. So we were able to talk to policymakers and be able to remove a regulation. So now people can get a takeout meal and a takeout cocktail or margarita, you know, a good bottle of wine from a restaurant, which again helps generate some economic activity. The second thing is that, you know, talking to a businessman who, like a lot of small businessmen, owns a few different stores, but these are spread out in 4 different counties in Southwest Ohio. Government does not do complicated things very well. And trying to administer a lot of the rules that have come out has created a great deal of confusion. So our entrepreneur was hearing basically 4 different rules of what he could do to serve his customers. He could open in one county for takeout, another county he couldn't whatsoever. So as a result, he ended up having to shutter all of his businesses in all 4 counties to see his competitor going to the big box stores, which puts him at a real disadvantage. So we've called upon policymakers to try to train people with transparency, set the rules where everybody understands, not just businessmen, but some of these local officials, because that's the only way we're going to see businesses be able to revitalize, is if they know the rules of the road and they can compete.
Wow. Okay. Now, let me shift gears in a different direction And let's answer a question from one of our viewers who submitted it before the show started. This is a question from Natalie Simon in New Orleans. Natalie, glad you're with us. Hope you're doing well. Natalie asked if you could summarize and categorize some of the solutions Buckeye has put forth to your state in terms of immediate economic solutions, some that are kind of mid-range, and then the longer term that will help revitalize the economy. So can you walk us through a few examples in all of those categories, practically speaking?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the short term. So short term are basically recommendations that how you can get businesses up and running immediately. This is things such as making sure, again, restaurants can do carry-out cocktails, allow restaurants and pubs with outdoor seating to open before those that only have indoor seating, because that's a matter of public health. We also made recommendations to really lock down some of the gains we made on healthcare reform, because we know that people are reluctant right now to engage in everyday activities while they're scared of their own health. The medium range we'd be looking at and basically saying, we have a big problem with the fiscal policy. Let's look at some tax reform ideas for the next 2 years to give businesses immediate relief, help them hire people, get back to work, be able to expand their businesses. And then in our recommendations, we also look for long-term ideas. A big piece is education, being able to utilize education savings accounts, because as a parent with young boys, I suddenly find myself working and having to teach elementary school, middle school education again. And so I want to make sure that as parents, we can have dollars to figure out how we can best educate our kids in case we need to get them a better Chromebook, we need to get them some tutoring help online. Those are the type of long-term solutions that'll make a difference in the fall when we just heard Ohio schools may not be fully reopened.
Yeah, that's great. And as a reminder to everyone, the Q&A box is at the bottom of your screen if you have a question. I do have another question from a viewer, Ed Johnson. Ed, so glad you're joining us again this week. Ed always has great questions. Ed wanted to know, Ray, how you are making sure that governors are fighting the sources of these problems rather than just applying blanket restrictions to everything as they tend to do.
So I think the first thing we're doing is, again, we're taking a look from an economic standpoint, is making sure that the state can respond efficiently for health crises. So this could be a matter of making sure that healthcare providers can easily be able to practice in a city. For example, Cleveland, Ohio has far more cases than Columbus or some of the more rural areas. So let's make sure that we don't have to lock down maybe the entire state if we can get healthcare hospitals and providers to those hot spots in a timely fashion. We don't want to see a lot of regulations blocking the ability for state and businesses and individuals to respond. I mean, we're really in a moment of kind of the deregulatory state, where state regulations that have blocked everything from restaurants to businesses to nurses being able to come across the river from Louisville to Cincinnati to be able to serve people. And so if you can get rid of some of these regulations, that'll help make responses more timely and accurate. And finally, I think there's also probably a role for the state legislature to be able to take action. Right now, the state Ohio legislature is back. They're debating whether or not governors should be allowed, and the state healthcare director be allowed to issue emergency orders that last for months at a time without the people's body having another say. So I think that's a good process that we can make sure that there's another backstop, another way of accountability, so governors have some type of constraint that they're able to answer to the legislature, and really we're enforcing a good system of checks and balances.
Hey,
Tracy.
Rebecca, yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point, Ray, is in the long term, how are we going to be better positioned and ready for when the next pandemic or crisis like this occurs? And that is the steps that Buckeye is taking. There's a lot we can learn from.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, last question, Ray. So we always hear about jacks of all trades, but you appear to be the expert jack of all policy issues. You are well known in this network as somebody who's an expert on labor, healthcare, and the economy, and you are very active in all of State Policy Network's working groups to tackle these issues. And the whole point of the working group is to make sure that what happens in one state can spread to others. So can you talk to us a little bit about your work in those groups and how it's been throughout COVID and any kind of impact you guys are making?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I think Tracy really hit it well that, using these state policy network working groups, we're really able to effectuate change so much faster. Last week, we got a call from our Senate president who was very interested in basically pharmaceutical reform, making sure that pharmacists can test and treat illnesses more quickly now. I was able to sit there, hop on the phone with my friend from James Madison Institute in Florida, who passed an outstanding bill on pharmaceutical freedom. So we were able to get back to the answers to the Senate President's questions within 24 hours. Being able to learn best practice from other states to accelerate those changes makes all the difference. Of course, sometimes it's not always the good news. I like the idea that we're able to point to bad examples. And so taking a look at some of my neighbors up north, as we say in Ohio.
They're not here to defend themselves, but okay.
They defend as well as the Michigan football team does. So I think, being able to look at the executive orders where, right, the governors of Pennsylvania, Michigan saying nobody wants to do what they did. Right, we saw a complete total lockdown resulting in loss of economic freedom, individual freedom. And so having a group of people that you can sit there and quickly scan executive orders, exchange best practices, has really made it easier for us to learn from and basically pass great ideas from other states, and then take our ideas and being able to get those to hands and hopefully be implemented in states across the nation.
One last, I'm cracking up that the Ohio State-Michigan rivalry, lives on, but in a crisis, speed and agility make a difference. And the sharing of ideas, what Ray, the example Ray gave, how our Florida counterpart could share this win and he customized it for Ohio. This is what positions this network especially well.
Yeah, very well said. Thank you. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate it. All right. Well, now let's move over to our friends in Tennessee. Taylor, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Rebecca.
Now, Taylor, I want to say this again, and I said it to Ray, but I'll say it to you because it's so cool. Beacon Center was among the first groups to have their governor adopt some of the great economic policies that you put forth. Talk to us a little bit about why the governor approached you and said, help me through this.
Yeah, of course. So Governor Lee has been a longtime supporter of the Beacon Center. He was a friend to ours before he was in politics, and now that he is in the governor's office, it's been a great asset to be able to know their administration and get to work with them. And so Justin and the rest of our team said, this isn't going to slow us down. We've got to figure out, this isn't going to last forever. We've got to figure out how to prioritize healthcare and the economy. And as this has gone on, one of the mantras that we've been living by is protecting lives and livelihoods. It's not mutually exclusive. We can do both. And I think that the administration has seen that, and they've taken our solutions and put them into action because they trust us. We actually partnered with State Policy Network about a year ago and did some polling, and it found that the Beacon Center was the #1 most seen and heard organization in state government in Cordell Hall, which is our legislative building, around those people. And so we have the reputation of being able to put out solutions that will work and that do work.
That's right. And your governor must be listening because I think you're actually coming to us from your office today. Is that right?
Here
You're
I
the first person in their office.
I'm at the office. I've got my mask here for walking in and out of the office, but I'm here. I'm in the office. The state order has been lifted. Nashville is still under a stay-at-home order until May 8th. They're talking about that, but the state order is lifted. So we are here just up the road in Franklin. They have restaurants that are open at half capacity and people going in. So we're moving. We're getting ready to open back up and get people back to work.
Okay, well, Taylor, tell us more specifics then. What exactly did the Beacon Center recommend to the governor that was implemented?
Absolutely. So we have 2 separate policy packages. One was how to deal with the economic and healthcare fallout from this, and the other one was called Don't Call It a Comeback, which was recommendations for starting the economy back up. Of the 27 things that we have proposed, 12 have been adopted. And that includes things that we told the governor, don't do this. This is going to be a bad idea. Things like extending health care and unemployment benefits with no deadline indefinitely, changing the way those structures work for a short-term crisis. Another thing that we did that I think is very meaningful has to do with telehealth. There's a lot of talk about mental health during this time and people staying at home and people needing mental health counselors. And so one of the coolest things that I think that he did that we recommended was to allow people who have had their training and certification in these mental health fields, but may still be under the supervision of a practitioner, to be able to give telehealth services to people counseling in that mental health space. And I think that that's something that hasn't been talked about all that much, but is equally as important as making sure that people are healthy in the way of coronavirus.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, and I want to ask you the same question Natalie Simon asked Ray, because I think it's a really important one. As the Beacon Center looks to Tennessee at economic recovery in terms of things that can be implemented in the short term, midterm, and long term, what do you see as one or two of the most important pieces of each of those?
Definitely. So in the short term, the governor has already implemented a few of our solutions, including removing the ban on elective medical procedures. And one of the things that I'm most proud of that we were able to talk to him about is moving from delineating businesses as essential or non-essential to safe and unsafe. For
In fact,
example,
you guys were one of the first to say safe and unsafe. This was back, I think, beginning of March, where Beacon Center said, it's not about essential or not essential, it's about safe and unsafe. And I just want to tell you, that's amazing. Kudos to you.
Thank you. It came from, I got to know this family that runs a trophy shop in Memphis, Max and Mary Helen, a married couple. They live a mile away from their trophy shop, and they were just very upset that businesses were being labeled essential and non-essential when they had to give all of their employees a temporary layoff. And in their minds, they're thinking, like, we can sit at home together and not make money, or we can go into the office, close our storeroom completely, don't let people come in, but offer curbside pickup so that we can keep providing our services to people in a safe and clean way, keep making money so that we can hire our people back. That is essential for us and for them to be able to feed their families. And so that was a really important motivator for me to message the getting rid of essential versus non-essential and really bringing in the safe and unsafe following CDC guidelines.
Yeah, that's great. And then back to sorry, we digress. Back to the question. So you did a couple short term. What about some midterm solutions that are important for the people of Tennessee?
Yeah, I think that in the midterm and in the midterm and long term, we can learn from this and not allow another shutdown. Let's say that something does happen and there is another surge of coronavirus. What can we learn from what we did that can go forward into the future? And that carries into long term. I think we actually were asked by the governor's administration, what is one big, bold policy idea that can get Tennesseans back to work as quickly as possible? We were the only organization that they asked this to. And our policy team came up with a massive policy package of things that will cut red tape. For example, innovation waivers. We want to pursue one of the most bold and aggressive innovation waiver policies in the nation. We also want Tennessee to be the fastest state to grant a business license. 24 hours. We want to remove restrictions on occupational licensing so that people who need to pivot their career after this, if something happened, they lost their job, you can pivot really, really quickly. And we want to pursue policies that make cities favorable to business, allowing home businesses, keeping those property taxes low.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. So tell me a little bit more about the people within the communities that you've gotten to know through this coronavirus, because as I mentioned earlier, you have a reputation for getting in there and understanding how policy is going to affect the people of your state. You talked about the trophy folks. Were there any others that come to mind?
Definitely. There are a few business owners now, and Tennessee is in a great fiscal shape. I'll start by saying that, but the cities, maybe not so much. And so we've had to really watch the cities and say, don't misbehave now that the economy's bad and you might need some more money. And Nashville in particular has proposed a 32% property tax increase. Nothing motivates people to talk to you about what they're going through like facing a property tax increase or an increase of that kind. And so through this, people have been reaching out to us. Typically, it's me seeing something on Facebook and reaching out to people, but people have been reaching out to me and saying, I've been shut down for 2 months. I can't afford a 32% property tax increase. One in particular is a business owner in Nashville who has the absolute best ribs in the state of Tennessee, peg leg porker. I stand by that. He posted on Facebook, he sent an open letter to the mayor saying, you have forced me to shut down for a very long time and I'm struggling to survive, and now you want to raise taxes by 32%. He's just the most notable of those. I've talked to people who run construction businesses, people who run retail stores, who are really having a hard time making ends meet and then now facing another bad fiscal decision by Nashville's mayor.
That is incredible. Peg leg
Hey, Rebecca,
porker.
this reminds me of, sorry to interrupt. This reminds me, talking about Nashville, it reminds me a decade ago of how Nashville bootstrapped their way out of that flood damage and just their community problem solving strength. And I think what Beacon's trying to do to remind them of that, like we can do this in a private voluntary way without having to jack up taxes like this. So, I mean, Nashville can be an inspiration. I mean, they did get hammered by the tornado and now the COVID. You know, I got to go because I got to call you all and pack some boxes to get myself to Tennessee. But I appreciate these examples.
It's definitely inspiring to hear people who really want to get back to work and get in there, but don't want to be hit with those increases. And I think the state's doing a really good job, and we're just going to be really keeping our eye on the cities.
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. You started this years ago. You were the one in the network who started getting out there and getting to know the people impacted by this stuff. And we've seen a trend. Just about everybody who's come on the show has had a story like yours, and it's really good to see it throughout the network. So thank you for all that great work. All right, here's a question for you. Shifting gears again, the legislative session in Tennessee is coming back this summer. So it's two-part. What are you guys doing to make sure some of these good reforms last? And also, what big fights do you anticipate ahead that you can win that maybe you couldn't have won before COVID started?
Well, our session, you're right, we're coming back on June 1st. We are already in here gearing up on it. And I really do think that these freedom and innovation in healthcare things are fights that we probably couldn't have won before. Certificate of need, for example. If you're not familiar with certificate of need, it's basically a permission slip from the government to open a healthcare facility or alter a healthcare facility, anything from putting more beds in an assisted living facility to opening an ambulatory care center. All of these require a certificate of need from oftentimes the competitors of the people who are trying to open them. And we want to change those laws. We want to encourage freedom in opening these healthcare facilities. I actually know a doctor very well who was one of the first direct primary care physicians in the state, and he opened his facility out in the middle of nowhere, and it was so hard for him to get a certificate of need, even though these people in rural communities really needed a facility like his. And so we're hoping to go into this session to continuing the work that we did years ago and stripping away some of these CON restrictions, just really doing away with them and saying, listen, if we've learned anything from this, it's that people need access to care no matter where they live. Another thing is telehealth. That's something else that I don't think would be as top of the priorities list for many lawmakers like it is now. I was on a call recently with some folks in our office. There were 4 of us on there, and all 4 of us had been on some type of telemedicine visit since this started.
Yes.
Yes, I think we can all pretty much relate to that. I did, and a lot of people in our office did as well. And so I think that this is something that people are saying, okay, well, maybe people who were hesitant about it before are saying, well, it worked during this time. Why can't it work during the rest of the time? And then that's on the state level. Again, on the local level, I think we're going to be fighting a lot of property tax increases and things of that nature as cities are trying to bounce back from years and years of fiscal mismanagement and then now this immediate crisis.
Yeah, that's a great point. We have a question in from Ed Johnson. And the question is, and this we can open it up for all of our guests today, how do your initiatives address going to the fire of the crisis? In other words, what kind of support is there for the elderly in the current case. And Ed, I think what you're asking, if not, type this in for clarity, is how are we addressing folks who are perhaps 65 and older and maybe more likely to suffer from the coronavirus? Yes, okay. Ray Taylor, that is the right question.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things is that we've been looking at is how to make sure that people have resources to be able to get access to the care. I mean, Taylor's mentioned a lot about telehealth ideas, but, you know, for example, one of the ideas is that the elderly people are more vulnerable. So being able to see their healthcare provider from the safety of their own home, being able to see it from the safety of a nursing home instead of having to go out in public can really do a great deal of good to keep these people kind of in the safest environment possible to be able to get the care they need.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is making sure that they can be safe, and also allowing the services that deliver food to them and things like that to be able to operate freely.
Thanks, guys. We have another question from Byron Lamb, and I'd like to direct this one to Tracy to start. Byron, thanks for joining us. Byron saw an article discussing the new tide of big government conservatives. We've all heard that word a lot lately. How do you counter this sentiment within the network, Tracy?
Yeah, this is indeed a challenge, but the fact is the brand of this, I mean, it's an opportunity for us to clarify the brand, the state-based brand of being fiscally prudent, of being fiscally conservative. And the austerity, practical austerity ideas, and the way that Ray and Taylor have described how they're working with policymakers to find private voluntary solutions without having to raise taxes, and giving them practical alternatives to cut spending. This is where this network really cut our teeth, right? This is where we got our brand in the first place of limited government. And I think that's where we can continue to amplify that as is appropriate within each state, really unleashing the power of this network to bring that forth will better clarify where we stand on that.
Great. Taylor and Ray, do you guys have anything to add?
Yeah, you know, I think a lot about that in Ohio, right? I mean, we've been nicknamed the Rust Belt state, you know, and the idea that good times are not coming back here. And I think a lot of some of the momentum is because the idea that maybe there's not as much opportunity here in the United States now as there used to be. And so at Buckeye, we've kind of been looking at what we're calling our prosperity initiative. And the idea is using free market solutions to go out there and help people get better jobs. For example, you know, talking to people in career centers, and not everybody wants to be a Buckeye at Ohio State. Some people sit there and say, you know what, I'd rather work with my hands, I'd rather work outside. So making sure that they have opportunities to get trained in different types of skills, that government regulations aren't blocking them from becoming a plumber, getting promoted when they're a nurse, having to go through a lot of red tape if they want to change professions. Those are the type of solutions I think that increase opportunities, and we're seeing great results from a lot of these career centers, community colleges in Ohio, being able to train people and get them into the workplace at good jobs.
That's great.
We know and we've seen that our solutions work. And so I think that think tanks exist for this purpose, is to show people that big government conservatism doesn't work. Keeping the government small. I mean, we've got legal centers who are here challenging government overreach. We've got policy teams that are going in and trying to slash all these red tape things, and, you know, call it bragging, whatever you want to call it. Our solutions work. And I know in a time like this, when everyone wants an immediate fix, it might be hard to prove that, but over time we've seen and will continue to see that our solutions work, and that's why we're here.
Yeah, and Taylor, to your point, we've always known that our solution works, but all of a sudden, as I said earlier in the show, and I cannot drive this point home enough because it's why this moment is so important for this network, because there's an opportunity where others are opening their minds to them on both sides of the aisle. So thank you, guys. Okay, another question from the audience. This is from Paul Farago in North Carolina. Paul, so glad you're here. It's been a while since we've seen each other. Paul asked, what will it take for this idea of an economic lockdown against the virus to become a discredited political practice? So the politicians who are using it as a political play, how are we handling that, Tracy?
I'll start, and I'm sure Ray and Taylor have better ideas, but I will echo what Taylor just said, is that our ideas work. And having these demonstration projects out in the state, I mean, laboratories of democracy, and then us amplifying and celebrating what works. I mean, seeing is believing. And when people get relief from more flexibility, from more choice, from telehealth, it helps them understand and connect the dots of how market principles can alleviate suffering. Now, part of the challenge is some of the data on the virus. I mean, the virus data has been all over the place. And so as that becomes clearer, we can help the public connect the dots on how our ideas on the ground in practice can mitigate suffering. So I'll hand it over to the experts here.
I think at least, and this might be a hopeful view, but I think to a degree, at least in Tennessee, the economic lockdown model has already shown to be very ineffective. I mean, there is a protest going on at the courthouse 1 block away right now saying, please let us open our businesses. And so, and that might just be because Tennessee is a more passionate for freedom state. I'm not sure, but I will say that seeing the economic damage and the hurt that this has caused a lot of our small business owners. I mean, polls are coming back from people saying, we trust small business owners, let them go back to work. I think only time will tell. And I think in Tennessee, time has told that this is not something that people are taking lightly, or that people consider to be a bold move, locking down the state.
And I think, as you said many times, states learn from each other, think tanks learn from each other. And so seeing some bad examples that people realize, where governors like in Pennsylvania could sit there and say, we choose which businesses are open. And Ohio, we had to deal with an influx of people from Pennsylvania voting with their feet, driving across the border to come do business in Ohio. So telling those type of examples, people realize this doesn't make any sense. The government is being capricious and arbitrary and hurting businesses and constraining freedoms. So I think, people have learned, and nobody has gone as far as our neighbor, Governor Wolf has, and these type of orders, because we see the bad examples and people are able to point out and say, look, this simply doesn't work. Why are you doing this? You're hurting people.
Thank you. Okay, Tracy, I'm going to pop it back over to you to see if you've got any final thoughts before we close out today. This has been a great conversation. Thanks, guys.
There's been a lot of helpful themes here, right? Flexibility, customization, the speed and agility of sharing what works and what doesn't work. And then our spokespeople on the ground, people that live in their states, that have the relationships with policymakers and know people and have stories of people who are really suffering and can and amplify those to demonstrate how our ideas can really change lives. I think the more that we can at SPN celebrate those and lift them up and broadcast them broadly on webinars like this and with other folks in the media, we can demonstrate once again that state solutions can lead to national impact. This is the great experimentation. In times of crisis, opportunity opens up. A gap has opened up. We have, I think, a finite amount of time to push these ideas forward rapidly. I mean, we'll always be pushing these ideas forward, but sometimes are more opportune than others. Now is that time. And I'm just so impressed and inspired by the CEOs and the organizations out in this network who have just leapt to this opportunity to really serve the people in their states. On a dime, these think tanks switched gears to address the crisis, to be relevant and responsive to the needs of people in their states, to get the ear of policymakers, and to respond when governors called them. So I just think it really demonstrates just how this network has been built up, how the investments that have been made by our generous donors through the years are really starting to pay off.
Thank you. That was very well said. And you gave me a great opening to talk about next week's show, because Tracy's right. Now is the time. And without strong leaders in this movement, nothing would get done. And so next week, we are going to feature a few of those leaders and talk about leadership in times of crisis. So hope you guys can join us next Wednesday, 1 o'clock, for another show. And I can't thank you for joining us, for being a part of this network for so long, and making it possible for all of these great things to happen across the states. Thanks so much, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye.
Take care.